Hi guys, Luke LaFontaine here up at Cold Steel. So I wanted to go over today and give you guys a little debriefing about the difference between knives and daggers and how that relates to the historical progression of them as well. Now, we all know a knife. You've seen knives. Cold Steel makes hundreds of knives, and the term knife is a really generic term that has come to mean a single-edged bladed anything that's used for utility or cutting purposes. So, let's start right off. This is our Skinner, and this is our 10-inch chef's knife. Now, both of these are knives. They're single-edged. This has got a 10-inch blade. This blade's about 7 inches. If you look at them, the purpose of this knife is utility first. This is a work knife. You use this to cut food. You use this in food preparation. It's a utility. It's a tool piece. It's a utility knife. This isn't something that would be used for self-defense or military purposes. But in the medieval period, this, as you have come to know as a chef's knife, in history used to be the medieval peasant's knife. This blade shape and design goes all the way back to about 700 AD, even further in some cases. This design, and the reason this design was created was because this wound up being the all-around utility tool knife that could do everything for a person in the medieval period. It wound up being called the medieval peasant's knife, but this wound up doing everything. People were super poor. If you look at the medieval period, people were poor. If you weren't a member of the nobility, you didn't have money. People were using all kinds of things, iron, steel, and a knife was an expensive tool. So a person in a household might only have one knife, and that one knife had to do everything. So the ideology behind the medieval peasant's knife was this was his EDC, this was his everyday carry, because this knife did everything for him. He had to carry it for self-defense. He had to carry it to be able to cut and chop things. He had to be able to carry it to prepare food. He had to carry it while he was hunting. So he might go and find a boar or a pig or a small deer, shoot it with a bow and arrow, finish it off with this knife, skin it with this knife, clean it up with this knife, cut it apart with this knife, and then take it home and cook it up. So this knife had to do everything because he only carried one knife. But again, it's a knife. Its purpose primarily is it's a utility tool for everyday use for the peasant to do everything with. The difference between a knife and a dagger. A medieval dagger was more of a military sidearm. The sole primary purpose of this is to stab. It has an acute point and it's double-edged. So the design of this, its principal use is self-defense, offense, and stabbing as opposed to being a utility tool. It's a weapon first and a utility tool second. That's how it was used in history. A medieval knight would always have something like this on his side so that even if he wasn't carrying his sword, he'd always be carrying a dagger like this because it served all the same purposes. It was self-defense, it was offense, he'd use it for eating, he'd cut his food up with it, he'd cut rope with it, but this was something that was at his side all the time. And if you look at the difference between a knife and a dagger is almost always double-edged and comes in a long blade down to an acute point. A knife, for the most part, can be single-edged, have a thinner profile, and be used primarily for utility cutting purposes. This is more of a medieval military sidearm or tool. And it came in a number of different variations. These are all types of daggers. They all had primary different purposes but they were all technically daggers. Now, this is a lot smaller than this. We're talking about different time periods. This is right around the 12th century, whereas this is the 16th century. You'll notice there's a difference in the design. This is a heavier, stouter blade. This blade, while still being stout, comes to more of a acute point, and it's got a more drastic change from the width down to the point of the blade. It gets narrower, and it has a different guard. This has got a ring guard on it with quillions. They both have quillions, but this has a ring guard. I've had a lot of people ask me about the ring guard on daggers. A lot of people are always like, what do? Do you put your finger through it? Is it a cup holder? No. The ring on the side of a dagger, this is technically called a main gauche or a parrying dagger. This is a secondary weapon that was carried with your sword for self-defense purposes. It had long quillions and a side ring. If you look at my hand, that ring is covering the outside of my hand, so that if a sword blade were to come down, it would hit that ring and bounce off and not cut my fingers. So if you're talking about the period in the 16th and 17th century of sword fighting, the ring was a protective device on the hilt of the dagger. It wasn't just there for decoration. It literally was there. If you look at my finger, you can see how the ring protects my finger. That was the purpose of this type of hilt. But again, this is a dagger, a different type of dagger. But you can see they come in all different shapes and sizes. The reason being, one, people are all different shapes and sizes. You have super tall people, you have short people, you have wide people, you have skinny people, you have big muscly guys. People come in all different shapes and sizes. It wouldn't make a lot of sense for someone that was 6'8" and 300 pounds to have a really teeny dagger like this. But somebody else that had a different purpose, let's say they were in the military, and they were a little guy, they were 5'4", and they had to crawl through tunnels and go through narrowed passageways and be in heavy, thick brush, they'd have a smaller, more compact knife so that this dagger didn't get in the way. They could still use it. It still served all of its purposes, but they weren't going to get hung up with something huge and long like this. I can't crawl through the spaces in tunnels in a castle wearing this big long dagger. It would get hung up on everything. But, like I said, they come in all different shapes and sizes. This being a medieval dagger, and this being the classic Cinque Dia of Italy, which was still considered a dagger. It's a house dagger that was worn for self-defense and prestige in the very late 15th and early 16th century in Italy. But you can see they're very, very different. They're different style-wise, they're different shape-wise, but this is still technically something that would be considered a dagger. It's a house dagger. These varied in length. The minute you get upwards of 15, 16, 17 inches, you're now talking about something closer to a short sword. You're no longer talking about a dagger. This is about the right size for a house dagger. So that anything that gets longer, we start going into the realm of short swords. We're not talking about a sword, not talking about a dagger anymore. So even though this is big and hefty and stout, this is still technically a type of dagger. So when we look at all these different shapes, we notice one thing is pretty much the same on all of them. They're double-edged. They start at a wide, strong base, which is really stout, and they come down to an acute point. And the purpose of that, in terms of medieval warfare, was stabbing. It could also cut, if I needed to cut rope, or I was out in the woods and I had to use this, I could use it for everything. But this is primarily a military blade, a military sidearm of the medieval period. Which brings us to our newest addition that you guys haven't really seen yet. This is our large parrying dagger, a large quillion dagger that we're offering for 2020. Now this combines everything from all the other daggers on this table. This basically, in terms of a sidearm or a swordsman's secondary defense weapon, this combines everything from all of these blades into one parrying dagger. You'll notice it's got a really wide, hefty blade that comes down to an acute point. It is very thick. It's got Downturned quoins, a very, very large side ring, and it's stout and heavy. The purpose of this is I can parry an actual sword with this. And I mean sword. I don't mean a lighter 17th century rapier or a very, very light side sword. I'm talking about a hefty side sword or an actual cross-hilted sword. A dagger like this could actually parry that blade and save your life in a 16th century sword fight. We made this because we wanted to show the difference, and we wanted to add to our line and show the difference between the pieces that we make. These are obviously two, although similar looking, they're two very, very different daggers. This is a lot heftier. This is something that someone in the 16th century could carry for self-defense as well as a fashion item, but you can see the difference in size between both of them. And they're both very historical examples of 16th century parrying daggers, which also went up into the 17th century. This dagger still existed. So, a part of history. This is a historical piece. Comes with a really nice leather sheath, but this combines all the qualities of the rest of these daggers. You notice they're just about the same size blade, but this has got very sharp downturned quoins for hand protection and the ring. So, medieval dagger, Renaissance dagger, but they all served a purpose so that this type of piece in history had multiple purposes. We no longer have to have something like a dagger for self-protection. We don't need this for self-defense. But in the period at the time, in the 16th century, the 15th century, the 14th century, it wasn't the nicest time period, and you had a social order where people were a lot more desperate. So it made a lot more sense because you didn't have a technical police force during that period. You had town guards. So if I had an area that was spread out over 40 or 50 miles, you might have 2 town guards watching thousands of people. So a gentleman walking at night in Italy at 2 in the morning, it'd make more sense for him to be carrying something like this at his side. Also, the different construct of the time, people were swordsmen back then. You studied the use of the sword because that was what people did in fashion, and that was your primary means of self-defense. So it was a very, very common thing to have a large quoin dagger, a parrying dagger on your belt, as well as a utility piece in terms of if gentlemen went out hunting all the time. They went out on hunts. So if you went out on a hunt, you'd carry something like this, and this would be the same thing. This would be on your belt. Why? If I'm hunting gigantic wild boar that weigh a couple hundred pounds and have huge tusks, and I get cornered by that thing, I'm going to need something like this to fend that thing off, because if you get the wrong end of a boar's tusk, you're in big trouble. But again, when you talk about this time period, these daggers all served a purpose. And as much as they have sort of gone out of fashion, they're still a very, very viable piece of history. And for collectors and people that are interested in historical reenactment and the history of arms and armor, it's important, and I think it's a great thing to still be able to have examples of all of these pieces through history. I've been to a lot of museum exhibits all around the world. And the other thing is, when you get into inner cities and you get around the rest of the United States, there aren't a lot of arms and armor exhibits. There aren't a lot of exhibits in museums where people get to see our history and the history of Europe. So the fact that secondarily, we as a company and other companies make replicas of all these historical period pieces means it keeps the history alive so that this doesn't die off and disappear, and we don't have something where people are discussing it 10 years from now and they go, well, you know, I could tell you about that history, but it's all gone now. People have stopped making them, they've fallen away, and it would be a piece of history in schools and universities where it just wouldn't get taught because all of a sudden they wouldn't be around anymore and we wouldn't know anything about them. So these things all play an important part in terms of education about the history of mankind. And with all of these, these all played an important part in history, and that's the difference between a utility knife, which we now use as a chef's knife, and a period dagger. So I hope that was informative, and I hope it gives you a little bit more in my long-winded explanation to tell you a little bit about the history of bladed weapons. Thanks, keep watching.